Hi, I'm Schmocker, lead artist at Locomotive, and I want to show you my process of creating artwork for a game for changing tides. For this painting I want to depict a rocky landscape of the game and have an ancient ruin in the background and tow the character in the foreground. I usually start the painting with blocking out the big shapes quite early on to get a bit of a feeling of the overall composition and the mood of the piece. Also putting in some colors quite early on that may change up quite a bit in the process, but I just sort of want to have the palette right at the beginning and can also easily pick from that and mix up some colors so they won't be too flat in the whole process. So I can have some yellows and maybe some blues mixed in with the brown of the rocks. I think that keeps things a bit lively throughout the whole process. I like to keep things a little bit chaotic at this point of the process and to experiment with different shapes and just use the big brush to maybe go into directions I haven't previously planned to see where it leads me. Also to sort of keep the energy in the painting that I mostly have at the beginning of the process, and later on it gets more static, I would say, and I want to have as much of the painting figured out as early on, and then I can use the more detailed static or planned process later on in the painting to finish up the whole picture. Even though I want to have it chaotic, I try to get at least the big shapes as defined as possible. Something I'm still learning and try to figure out how I can do it best, but it's something I only made positive experience with. Like the earlier you have the shapes and especially I think the outlines of the shapes, to try out a few things here and there at some different angles and see what looks best. It's always a difficult thing with the rocks, that should they look more round, they be more spiky. They can have quite a different mood depending on how the shape looks like. You can later on add details without changing the picture too much. Other than the shapes, I try to put down the lighting early on and some smaller objects to define the scale of the larger objects, like the ancient ruin in the background. And I try to get the layers right to check if the foreground has more contrast compared to the background, to also define a bit how far away in this case the rocks in the background are, how large they are. Also some other elements with like the water and the main character in the foreground. Just so I have defined or maybe laid out the whole painting very early on to give me a bit of security or guidance while trying to figuring things out later in the process, so that I mostly can focus on the details and some lighting to make the picture look good, and not just to design the shapes again and to figure out where I should put the lighting, because I think it helps to do that early in the process for me. After I laid down everything, I now focus on the individual elements of the painting and take a bit more time to define those and to add detail to those objects without switching too much, probably. I do this way too often, to just work on one thing, then switch to another one. And for this video, I try to focus a bit just on one object before I go to the next. I think that's probably also easier to follow. I start with the ancient ruin in the background. That's one of the more undefined areas in the painting, and it's a good idea to define it now, just to see if it really turns out how you imagine it to be. I think there's also some design work I have to do, and to see if it fits with the whole aesthetic of the ancient culture that is also part of the game. The ancient structures are human built, and they used sort of a metal that's now very rusty and looks quite red to contrast the whole bluish colors of the water. They also have a lot of pipe-like industrial elements, and at the same time I want to combine it with some animal characteristics, sort of to show a little some kind of eyes or some kind of face, to make them a bit mysterious and also a bit spooky, just so that the whole design by itself creates some tension, I would say, or to create some mystery. And it's not just a building that's nice to look at, but you could imagine a bit what kind of culture it was that built these kind of structures. Now, for these structures, I try to combine two things that are a little bit difficult to do at the same time, I would say. On one side, it's a very large building that should have a lot of detail, and I want to have it also feel a bit ominous and have quite dark areas. And on the other side, it's far away. It should sort of have less contrast to make it feel far away and to make it feel big. So on one side it should have a lot of detail and contrast. On the other side it should be a bit faded. And how I try to solve this is that I really try to put the detail and the contrast just on a few places, mostly at the top, sort of at the head of the building, and the lower part is surrounded by fog, a little bit desaturated, and just has some sort of a very rough painterly style, and probably just some smaller details to see. This solution also helps me to spend less time on the overall building, and so don't have to just put details everywhere, and I can really focus on these few elements, add some highlights to the edges, add some small dark lines, just to sort of show or suggest a little bit of detail, or to show a bit how it's constructed. And the rest of the building can be quite rough, and I think I personally really like this effect to contrast the detail and the more polished areas with the rougher parts that can be painted quite fast. But I think it's difficult to get the balance right, so it doesn't look like just two parts put together improvised. Also, the little statues at the foot of the big structure could have some detail, because they're actually not that little. They are way taller than a human, and they're mostly there to show the big scale of the big structure in the background. You cannot really have enough detail on the head of the structures when you just choose some areas where you put a lot of detail. I think at one point I just have to stop but I think it's just to add some small broken parts, some small pipes sticking out, could do a lot to make it feel bigger and to add some interesting areas that show a little bit of the character and of the design of the object, and at the same time, because the eye is already there, it's nice to have more things to look at. Rocks are always a difficult but also interesting thing for me to paint, because I want to keep them very dynamic and only add detail where I really have to, and the rest is painted by big brush strokes, and I try to sort of see where it leads me and add some light here and there that define the overall three-dimensional shape a bit more. In general, I want to have a strong contrast between the sort of smaller parts of a rock that are more detailed and the large main body of the rock that's way less detailed, sort of to keep things interesting and to, in this case, to lead the eye away from the edges of the painting towards the center of it. The large rocks far in the background mostly show their detail where the light hits, because they're so far away and they have less contrast. And because of that, I also want to use a lot of light for that, to sort of have this sunset or sunrise like mood and lighting that hits the background rocks from one side, so they kind of have some detail, but don't stand out too much, and don't have too many dark areas like the rocks in foreground. For me, they're a fun way to fill or create empty space. It's always interesting to see what the end result is compared to what I initially imagined it to be. Sometimes the overall three-dimensional shape changes a lot, but the outline stays the same. Sometimes they have too much detail at the start and I have to reduce it and to get back the initial dynamic energy from the start that I talked about. It's always a fun process for me, even though the main focus of the picture is not really on them, but more on the structure in the background. Now I spend a little bit of time to touch up the water, because in Far Changing Tide the world is flooded. The water is omnipresent in almost every concept art or painting I paint, and I also like to put to show the water, the underwater areas below the surface, to create a little bit of interest and to show a little bit of contrast between what's above the water and what's below. Maybe it's a little bit darker, maybe there's something in there. In this case, I didn't want to add too much detail there, to focus more on what's above the water, but still to suggest that there's could be something there. The brighter areas of the water also help to highlight the area around Toe, to make him more easily recognizable in the context of the picture, which is, by the way, also a challenge in the game, to make him be more visible because he's so small. So it's always nice to have some light or some color that help putting him into contrast and to make him more visible on the screen or on the picture. The character Toe is also important as a reference of the size of the environment and of the background objects, and also sort of gives the viewer and the player, in case of the game, a relatable element. Even though the characters in the picture, I didn't choose to have the ship painted as well, mostly to focus more on sort of the environment aspect of the game or of the painting, and to show a bit of the ancient architecture there, but also I think the ship takes so much time to paint, and it's on a lot of paintings already, so I wanted to mix things up a bit and still have some elements in the picture to tell a bit of a story. How you can see, I have a bit of trouble painting the hair of Toe. So sometimes I get it right with the first few brush strokes, but sometimes I really have to paint over it and over it again until it finally gets the shape I really want to, with different orange colors and where the light hits, and the right kind of messy hair. Yeah, but I think in the end it looks okay. So now I want to touch up the different areas in the painting a bit, starting with the sky, because I haven't really worked on the sky yet. I also think it doesn't need too much work, because it's so many other things in the foreground that are obstructing the sky. But I think a little bit can be done. And I also like to paint some clouds. I like to keep the painting mostly on one layer, especially if it's sort of a quick one or a sketch, and not a large artwork that needs to be used in different situations and have a lot of very polished detail. I think mostly to be able to switch between different elements quite quickly, and also to avoid these very clean edges between the layers, so it's a bit of it looks a bit more painterly, and it feels a bit more organic compared to very constructed artwork. In this case, I make an exception for the sky, because it's quite annoying to paint it in between the gaps of the rocks. And it's also good to use the flow of the big brush strokes to make to show a bit of the cloud movement and cloud dynamic in the background, and also that the edges don't get this overpainted quite blurry look in the end. I have to resist the urge a bit to paint big detailed clouds in the background, because the sky is not that important and also doesn't have much space on the picture. But I still wanted to have some more dramatic weather showing in the background to show that it's maybe afternoon, maybe early evening, and to give a bit more depth to the picture. Now I add some more details in areas I felt needed it more, and also tried to make the contrast a bit stronger between the foreground and the background. And I added some little birds around the mouth of the ancient structure to further show how large this building is. I also tend to be a bit too careful with the colors, especially in the later stages of the painting. So I use sort of different layer at the end to try things out and to go a bit more extreme, to add some colors, some colder colors in area that were previously generally warm, just to create some variety and to lead the eye more into the center of the piece. So I added more of the bluish, darker colors around the edges of the picture. It's quite late in the process, but I wanted to make the format a bit wider, and I felt like I could do it without taking too much risk and turning the whole thing upside down, just by adding some more things to the composition. So I expanded the rocks on the left and the right side to have this more of a wide landscape shot. And here's the finished piece. I hope you liked this quick process video. It was the first time I did something like this, and it was a nice experience to reflect on my own process while painting